Institute for Religious Liberty. And as we do at every event at Thomas More College, we will begin with asking our college chaplain to open with a prayer. Father Derek Fidel.
O God, creator of all, you give us life and plant within us a longing to know you. You reveal your glory in all the beauty of the universe. You draw us toward your goodness, and you arouse a hunger to give fitting response to the wonder in our hearts, to deepen our knowledge of you, our source and origin, to find words to express our awe at all we receive from you. As we strive to discover how best we might show our reverence, we acknowledge our frailty and failures to respect one another's efforts as we ought. Grant that we might learn ever more fully to respect another's right to live their faith in freedom, in peace, and tranquility, so that our voices may join together in one great harmony as we proclaim, to you be all honor and glory forever. Amen.
Now I'd like to ask our president, President David A. Armstrong, who is entering his 5th year as president of Thomas More College, along with a small group of community leaders several years ago. Dave was instrumental in the creation of this Institute for Religious Liberty. He's been an enthusiastic supporter and driver for the events such as this ever since. And I know I couldn't do the work that I do without his support. He works to continue the vision of his mentor, friend, and my friend, distinguished Thomas More alum Bill Robinson, in collaboration with Interfaith community leaders. In fact, we have 2 other board members of the Institute for Religious Liberty I would like to ask to stand. Dr. Gary Zalar and Brett Greenhalgh. An amazing support to us. There's no better representative, no better champion for this college in my mind than our president, David Armstrong. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the 14th president of Thomas More College, David A. Armstrong.
Good evening, everyone. We do have some more seats up front, so students, come on up, don't be shy. We want you to be seated. This is a wonderful event. It's very special to be here tonight in front of you and seeing so many of our faculty and students here. You make us very proud, and so I can't thank you enough for being here and supporting this event. 4 years ago, William T. Robinson, class of '67, came forward and said, Dave, we need to do something about protecting religious freedom. We have the clergy, we have the religious, they've dedicated their lives, but we as citizens of the United States need to do something to protect religious freedom. And with Dr. Gary Zola and Brett and Aaron and others came together, and through that we started the Institute for Religious Liberty. Thomas More is the patron saint of religious freedom in the Catholic Church. It was only appropriate. And tonight is very special because we are bringing 3 scholars of the monotheistic faiths together. And for reasons that are sad in a lot of ways. As a lawyer, I always said that religious freedom was under attack and we needed to protect it. Religious freedom is an inalienable right in our Constitution. And it was under attack legally. Hobby Lobby, Little Sisters of the Poor, other cases, the government demanding that the churches and people could not practice their religious freedom in certain ways. But now, literally, religious freedom is under attack. This event is a result of Dr. Hebert bringing people together after the Hebrew Union College, some items on the campus were defaced over the summer. And we said, quickly, we stand strong with our brothers and sisters at the Hebrew Union College. And then, of course, we had the shooting in Texas. So we talk about under attack. Religious freedom is under attack. The only way we can protect it is by standing together. If you believe that you want to have religious freedom, then we have to stand with others who are not the same as us together. And we need to find our similarities. That's what tonight's all about. I want to thank Joan Robinson here, William Robinson's wife, who's been so supportive of Thomas More alum. And I want to thank Bob Sappy, best friend of William Robinson, who's helping us lead the charge to endow the Institute for Religious Liberty as the William T. Robinson Institute for Religious Liberty. And God bless Bill. He always said to me, Dave, the biggest question is how do we make a positive difference in the lives of those we are privileged to serve? And as Bob said earlier at our dinner tonight, we need to make sure that this goes on forever. Protecting our religious freedom needs to go on forever. So God bless Bill, may he rest in peace. He's always with us. And as always, God bless you and go Saints. Thank you.
I'm just going to have a very short introduction of our moderator, Dr. Catherine Sherron, who is the chair of the philosophy department and also the director of our prestigious James Graham Brown Honor Society. And I'm going to say a little bit about each of our speakers, and then we'll let Dr. Sherron take it forward and we'll get going on this tonight. First, Tony. And you all have the larger description and you can read the details of each person. But Dr. Jonathan Cohen, Dean since 2011, Associate Professor of Talmud and Halakhic Literature at Hebrew Union College, ordained as a rabbi in 2012, the year after he became Dean, awarded the Rabbi Michael Madison Professorship for Emerging Scholars in 2003. Dr. Jeffrey Zalar, Ruth J. and Robert A. Conway Endowed Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Cincinnati, a Marine veteran of Operation Just Cause in Panama, 1989-90, and the first Gulf War, 1990-91. We thank you for your service, Jeff. Research is in the history of Catholic ideas and the religious foundations of Western civilization. And Dr. Waleed El-Ansary, the Hilal Hisham bin Laila Idris El-Swedi University Chair of Islamic Studies, the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice at Xavier University, consultant to the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, whose research focuses on the intersection of religion, science, and Islamic economics. So with that, I let Dr. Kate Sherron take over as our moderator. Thank you.
Shalom, peace, welcome all. As a philosopher, my role is to ask questions. The great philosopher Socrates' words, "The unexamined life is not worth living," prompts question after question. What we are doing here tonight is focusing on one such question, namely, examining our religious lives in light of what we as an interfaith community might understand to be the role of religion and why religious liberty is important. One of my favorite courses is a course in human nature, which focuses on death and dying. In fact, some members of the audience are students in this semester's course, or at least I hope they're here. We are! Just for the record. In death and dying, what we really are learning about is how to live well. And part of examining our own lives is challenging ourselves with others who perhaps see the world differently than we do. Our own stories are tied up in what we believe about living and dying, where we have lived and traveled, and of course, whether or not we practice a religion. All of that colors how we see the world. And for many of us, it is those religious commitments and traditions that constitute the foundation of our worldview and the rhythm of our lives. Honest, open, and sincere interfaith conversations like the one before you tonight remind me of the hymn, "This is my song, O God of all nations." Do you know it? Listen to these words. Is that going in and out?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. The words of the song go like this. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and wide. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. So I, your humble moderator, welcome you to approach tonight with generosity of spirit, with curiosity, with gentle probing questions. I invite you to think of this event as the first in an ongoing series of conversations. So the structure of the evening tonight is thus. Each of our panelists will give 15 to 20 minutes, they will, of prepared remarks about religious liberty as seen from the three Abrahamic traditions. Then they will have some time amongst themselves to follow up and deepen the conversation. And then we will ask questions from you, the esteemed and virtuous audience, written down on cards that will be distributed by some of our virtuous students. They will then be returned to me, and I'll ask most of the questions, although some, if you want to direct a particular question to a particular panelist, then just write the name on the top there. So now, please listen with me to our invited guests. First will be Dr. Jonathan Cohen, and then Dr. Jeffrey Zalar, and then Dr. Waleed El-Ansary. Welcome.
This is turned off.
We just won't use this one.
Can you hear me? Let's do this from here. Friends, President Armstrong, members of the board of the Institute for Religious Liberties, students, members of the faculty and guests, first of all, I would like to commend you for holding this event and to thank you for your gracious hospitality and to recognize and second your observation, President Armstrong, that such an event as this is all the more necessary today than it has been for years past and decades past, and that it is precisely this kind of event that will lead to greater understanding and to collaboration and community building. I am deeply grateful to all of you and to Thomas More College for hosting this event. Thank you. I would also like to start out by recognizing my colleagues and friends from across the river for coming together for such an event and for a series of conversations that may not be straightforward. Let me start with a short exposition on the subject of religious liberties and Judaism, and start out by suggesting that the very notion of religious liberties and their anchor in Judaism is not evident and is actually quite difficult. Our notion of religious liberty arises through modernity. Our notion of religious liberty arises through a world order that starts out in the late 18th century, that is very much represented in the founding documents of this nation, in this nation's constitution, and that finds expression in international instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Human Rights Conventions that now hold sway throughout the world, especially the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as national legislation in a whole number of different countries. Our notion of religious liberties is anchored in a notion of rights and liberties. And the notion that citizens enjoy rights and liberties is a modern notion. And so it would not surprise you to hear from me that in the context of our sacred scriptures, in the context of what it is that we understand to be the Mosaic covenant, God did not descend upon Mount Sinai and declare to Moses that he and the rest of humanity have rights and liberties that they should now enjoy forevermore. What he did, what was handed down to Moses, and what Moses expressed was not a notion of rights and liberties, but rather a notion of commandments, of obligations, and of responsibilities. The Jewish faith, the Jewish tradition, Jewish practice are anchored in the notion of commandment, of responsibility, of obligation, of one towards his or her fellow human being and towards God and the created world. Now, surely that notion of commandments, responsibilities, and obligations does give rise to derivative rights. If I am under obligation not to kill, the implication is that my fellow human has a derivative right to life. If I am under obligation and commandment not to steal, the implication is that my fellow human has a derivative right to property. If I am bound by a commandment and obligation not to transgress the personal and sexual integrity of another, the implication is that my fellow human being has a derivative right to personal and sexual integrity. And yet, our law, our covenant, is anchored in the very notion of commandment, of obligation, and of responsibility. Indeed, our rabbis understood, the sages of the Jewish tradition explicated, that there are no rights and privileges in our human condition, but for a sense of commandment and of responsibility. And so, among our commandments are commandments that relate to the love of God, the recognition of God, and the worship of the divine. And in the context of these commandments, our Hebrew Bible offers little tolerance for idolatry, for idolatrous practices, and for all kinds of transgressions, and indeed positively commands the children of Israel to destroy idolatry and to remove it from the world. So much for religious liberty. So much for religious freedom. And yet, our prophetic tradition speaks to the universal message that the Jewish faith sends out to the entire world. The great prophet Habakkuk, in the 2nd chapter of his prophecy, speaks to the message of the divine to the whole of humanity, and says to all who would listen, Tzaddik be'emunato yichyeh, the upright, the righteous, the honest, regardless of religious persuasion, in his or her faith shall live in the sight of God. The prophet Isaiah, thinking of all the nations of the world surrounding the Hebrews in Jerusalem, calls out to the nations and says to them in chapter 56 of the book of Isaiah, "Do not be concerned, the foreigner. You are not a piece of dried wood that has no future. Do not be concerned, the oppressed. For my house, Beiti yihyeh beit tfilah lechol ha'amim, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations." Indeed, the sages of the Jewish faith returned to the story of the creation of our world and wrote in Tractate Sanhedrin that when a king mints a coin, each coin that is minted bears the likeness of the king. And all coins are the same. And yet, the transcendent source of life that minted the whole of humanity has minted each and every human to be different. And in the same passage, in the very same pericope, our sages ask the question, why is it that the whole of humanity is taught that we are descended of one parentage, of one father and of one mother? And the rabbis reply, so that one man or one woman should not say to his or her fellow, my father is greater than yours. Indeed, it is this tradition that in many ways was in contact with Christian traditions, with Islamic traditions throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and various parts of Europe, that would eventually give rise to those traditions that would first be expressed in the Treaty of Westphalia following the 30 Years' War in 1648, recognizing for the very first time in a public international document that was legally binding the freedom of religion for members of various denominations and faiths in what we today understand to be Germany. It was these traditions and our writings, the inspiration of our sages, that would give rise to the understanding of pilgrims to this blessed land. That certain commandments of the 10, the first 5, were matters to be regulated between each person and his or her God. And the second tablet of the 5 commandments would be governed by civil administration and government. It would be this heritage that would give rise to the thinking and writing of such luminaries as Thomas Jefferson and those who produced our constitutional documents, those documents that guarantee the freedom of religion and conscience to all of us here in a country, the very first in the entire world, that would separate church from state and guarantee everyone's religious freedom, avoiding the need to emancipate and recognize religious minorities. And so, my friends, the story of religious liberties and freedom is long. It is anchored in a notion of creation that recognizes a divine spark in each and every one of us. A divine spark that we have come here together today to celebrate. Thank you very much.
I think we're okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I too would like to thank Professor Aber and Professor Sherron here and the Institute for Religious Liberty, as well as Thomas More College, all of you, for inviting me to participate in tonight's conversation. If it's all right with you, in accounting for how I got here, because I'm not an expert in religious liberty, I'd like to share certain aspects of my social background and walk you through certain episodes in my intellectual itinerary. And over the course of these short reflections, I'll mention 4 pillars of Catholic thought with regard to religious liberty that I hope will helpfully contribute to our conversation. On the block where I grew up in post-industrial Milwaukee, there were 2 types of people belonging to 2 different religions. There were Catholics like me, who attended the right church and attended the right school and worshipped at the right church. And then there were these other people called Lutherans, who went to churches we didn't even mention, and who participated on Wednesday nights in something foreign and intimidating called Bible study. None of that meant that much to me, however, because when we played football in the neighborhood, the Lutheran boy Peter was a reliable tackler, on the basis of which he enjoyed unassailable good standing in the neighborhood, despite his unfamiliar religious practices. Unfamiliar these practices certainly seemed, but I got over it, and I got over them, and in time, I married a Lutheran girl from the other side of town. Religious pluralism was a theme of in my own family as well. Most of us were Roman Catholic, but part of the family was Serbian Orthodox. Everyone had come to the United States from the Balkans following the First World War, settling in the sub-community of South Slavs on Milwaukee's south side. Great-grandma Jovanovich still attended St. Sava's Cathedral. When she died, we went to the funeral, and like so many others since St. Vladimir in the 10th century, we gaped at the unrivaled beauty of the church and the imposing depth of the liturgy. When I went to war in Kuwait, I met my first Muslims, not as enemies, you understand, but as friends and comrades. This is a true story. I was assigned to an 8-man intelligence collection team. 3 of its members were scions of Kuwaiti oil barons who were studying engineering at US universities when Saddam Hussein invaded their country. Desperate to discover the fates of their families, they offered to deploy with the American military as translators. The Pentagon gave them a rough and ready course in firing an M16, and I mean rough. And no one trusted these guys with weapons. And then assigned them to intelligence units like ours working across the battlefield area against the Iraqi army. Malik, Ahmed, and Lafi. We got to know them well, especially during the small hours of the morning when, alone in the middle of nowhere, we walked our position's perimeter or stood night guard in the machine gun pit. I used to watch them pray, and their devotion was genuine in a way that I truly respected and admired. Their regularity in honoring their commitments before their God, and encouragement to regularity in honoring my commitments before mine. I tell this story because I think, in some sense, I became a better Catholic as a result of knowing these Muslims. I never met any Jews until after the war, after even I had attended university. I met them in graduate school at Georgetown. Most of them were secular. But as a student of modern German history, I met religious Jews in another way, in the painful way that learning about the Holocaust always guarantees. These several examples, these several experiences, produced in me nothing like the indifferentism characteristic of secular approaches to religious pluralism. Rather, they supplied a personal context for the enormous respect I developed for religious traditions as sources of affirming communal solidarity, as living, intellectual, and material engagements with truth and beauty, and transformative methods of developing the interior life that speak to the inherent goodness of human reality and elaborate the ineffable splendor of the Creator. And here we arrive at a first pillar of Catholic thought with regard to religious liberty. This is that the dignity of the human person is bound up not so much with choice, not so much with the subjective disposition of an individual exercising his or her freedom amid religious options, but with his or her nature as a truth-seeking subject who realizes full personhood when one finds the truth, especially religious truth, and orders one's entire life to it. The plurality of religions, then, is less a convenience for an autonomous actor than an affirmation of universal longings ingredient to the human condition. Studies in graduate school continue. These studies reached across Western history. They included examinations of indisputable offenses against religious liberty by most religious groups, Catholics among them. Augustine's preference for compulsion in converting the pagans, the Crusades, centuries of unbroken anti-Judaism, the terror conversion tactics of some missionaries in the Americas and some Muslim Turks in Central Europe and the Balkans, the violence of the Reformation era. But I drew a conclusion from these studies very different from the one demanded by secular philosophers, a conclusion which since the 18th century stands as one of the greatest lies by which the modern world is constituted. The secular philosophers would have us believe that because religion as such is the cause of violence in the world, we must find our deliverance from it in secular reason and politics. The popes have recognized whatever can be said for this view. For example, shortly before his election to the papacy as Benedict XVI, in his famous dialogue with the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger declared, this is a quote, "We have seen that there exist pathologies in religion that are extremely dangerous, and that make it necessary to see the divine light of reason as a controlling organ. Religion," he went on, "must continually allow itself to be purified and structured by reason." This is the Pope. Notwithstanding the validity of these remarks, it is historically false, egregiously false, to hold that religion as such is the cause of violence in the world, and therefore we must find deliverance from it in secular reason and politics. Some forms of religious expression can become violent, just as some forms of secular politics, such as Nazism and communism, can become violent. The thinking person will want to consider the nature of these violent forms and take measures against them. But to disqualify religion as such on these grounds is just as unjustified intellectually as placing one's hopes uncritically in secular reason and politics, which, like religion, are susceptible to ignorance, the distribution of balkanized truth claims among competing tribal communities, and violence. And this brings us to a second pillar of Catholic thought with regard to religious liberty. Religious communities can pose a threat to human dignity, and therefore they must submit to the demands of public order. But their legitimate activities pertain to the common welfare. In fact, because of their supernal orientation, these activities transcend temporal affairs. Governments then, including those conditioned by secular politics and reason, which must provide for the common welfare, should not only tolerate religious communities, these governments must care for religious communities. These reflections on the potential in secular reason and politics for coercion and violence, especially against religious communities, hardly require lengthy academic demonstration. It ought to be enough to observe that in the modern world, this coercion and this violence has featured every imaginable type of harassment in the expansive toolkit of modern statecraft, to include legislative pressure, indeed legislative terror, intrusions on the privacies of the faith-based family, ideological interventions in education and faith formation, the imposition of unequal taxation, detention of individuals in constabulary prisons and concentration camps, torture, murder, ethnic cleansing, and genocidal massacre, such as in the communal destruction of Catholic peasants in the Vendée province by the Jacobins in 1794, at the very beginning of the modern enterprise in statecraft. Thus we arrive at a third pillar of Catholic thought with regard to religious liberty. Legal limits must be set to the powers of government so that states cannot encroach on the rightful exercise of religious freedom by individuals and associations. In addition, states must permit religious communities to function as mediating institutions between states and individuals as a necessary method of protecting individuals from the state's application of undue coercive and deadly force. Now, I admit that I'm particularly sensitive to the implications of this point. As a historian of modern Europe, I regularly instruct students in some of the greatest tragedies of modern times: the 2 world wars and the Holocaust, the Soviet calamity, police states in the communist bloc, the Bosnian massacres of the early 1990s. Truly, I have despaired many times at the response religious bodies made to these events, which always seemed late, in all events impotent, and generally lacking in philosophical depth. I need hardly add that in some, in fact in many cases, people involved in these events were religiously motivated. This undeniable fact must be a matter of shame, repentance, and remembrance for all religious communities tainted by the gargantuan violence of the modern world. But it is also a fact that the greatest crimes of modernity were committed by secular and ideologically motivated nationalist and revolutionary movements whose methods of government and population control all but universally included the marginalization, persecution, or outright destruction of religious bodies and their leaderships as preliminary to the establishment of totalitarian rule or as a method of exposing unwanted social collectives to attack. In this light, we might understand why the Catholic Church, for its part, especially since the 19th century, has insisted so vehemently on the protection of religious bodies as mediating institutions. Ideally, these institutions express limits to state power in the form of moral absolutes or negative statements that explicitly prohibit actions that violate irreducible aspects of human well-being. No state may kill the innocent, enslave, mutilate, torture, sell people, abort, euthanize, or exploit its workers in order to achieve a greater putative good. A state or ideological movement can never be right in choosing such actions. It must always be wrong. Secular and ideologically founded nationalist and revolutionary movements typically account for their actions by referring to proportionalist or utilitarian moralities. But when life, dignity, and the flourishing of human societies are at stake, the end never justifies the means. Religious liberty, then, is not just for individuals, but it's also for institutions, which have an important role to play in protecting all people against the enormous power of the modern state. A fourth pillar of Catholic thought with regard to religious liberty is more implied in official teachings than expressed in so many words, but it is no less valid for that. This is the principle that the liberty of one religious community depends upon securing the liberty of all religious communities. This has been said already in different ways, even by our college president. I wish I could tell you that the Catholic Church has always honored this principle. In point of fact, for most of its history, the Catholic Church claimed not only a primacy of honor, but an exclusive primacy of legal protection from cooperative state authorities. But on this subject, the Church's mind began to change in the face of massive state persecution during the modern period. To be more precise, the minds of many religious bodies began to change. Once again, as a historian of modern Germany, I know much about the so-called Kulturkampf, or struggle for civilization, that broke out in Germany in the early 1870s. Liberal anti-clericals in national government attacked the Church's public presence and sacramental prerogatives. Sermons fell subject to state supervision. Priests had to pass educational exams proctored by state officials. The state abrogated the Church's supervision of their own confessional schools. The state dissolved the Jesuits and other religious orders, amortizing their wealth to itself. Bishops who resisted were expelled. Priests were incarcerated. Heavy fines awaited the laity who resisted. Now, what's really interesting about this for our purposes is that by the end of the 1870s, a number of Protestant and Jewish communities, having initially, in some cases, applauded state measures against the Catholic Church, began to think again. If the state could do this to the Catholic Church, they reasoned, the state can do it to us. These communities now turned out in opposition to anti-Catholic Kulturkampf legislation, in what may very well have been the first substantive act of pan-religious solidarity against persecutorial state government in the modern period. The lesson all of these religious groups learned was that they stood or fell together. While it would take the Catholic Church nearly another century to recognize this principle in full, the deeper historical context of this recognition are there for anyone with the eyes to see. In our own time, religious liberty is growing as a zone of conflict, especially, it seems, as it concerns those with traditional views regarding marriage under the new marriage regime since the 2015 Obergefell decision. The punishment government interests may mete out to faith-based dissenters is suggested by measures pondered or already taken in related areas, to include the denial of education licensure and accreditation, revoking tax exemptions, imposing liability under public accommodation statutes and employment anti-discrimination acts, and closing access to government contracts and grants. Will America's faith communities stand together? Time, and it is surely coming, will tell. In all events, let me quickly review these 4 pillars of Catholic thought regarding religious liberty. There are other pillars, but these 4, I think, help us to join a conversation about religious liberty in our times. First, religious liberty is a requirement of human nature. Second, governments must not merely tolerate, but care for religious communities. Third, states may not encroach on the expression of religious liberty, nor may they restrict the function of religious bodies to serve as mediating institutions between individuals and state power. And fourth, the liberty of one religious community depends upon securing the liberty of all religious communities. Let this last point give you some sense of the fraternal love I bear for members of all religions who honestly seek the truth in a spirit of human comity and goodwill. Thank you once again for inviting me.
In the name of God, the infinite good, the ever merciful. That's the standard opening for all discussions by Muslims, and I think it's universally appropriate in Abrahamic brothers and sisters. I liked Dr. Sherron's opening very much when she said, Salam, Shalom, Pax Tikum, peace be with you all. I also would like to echo the sentiments of Drs. Cohen and Zalar regarding our thanks to President Armstrong, the trustees, Thomas More College, all of you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here tonight. I'd like to start with the central doctrine of the Islamic tradition, which is Tawheed. It's based on the unity of God. That while God is one, his revelation is necessarily multiple. That God's word can never be exhausted. And that it manifests itself in different forms. In Christianity, for example, Christ, for Christians, manifests himself as Word made flesh, an incarnation of the Son, as Jesus Christ. In Islam, and at least according to Orthodox Judaism, the Word of God manifests itself as book, Word made book. And so, although there are theological differences between the various traditions, the central principle is the unity of God on one hand, and the metaphysical necessity of the Word of God being multiple on the other. So let's just take this from a Christian point of view, for example. That we have the essence of God on one hand, which is one. But we have the three faces that God turns towards the world in terms of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, at least in terms of Western Christianity, Catholicism, and Protestantism. Then the question comes, how is it that those faces that God has turned towards the world can then only reveal a single revelation? In other words, the essence is one, the faces that God turns towards the world is multiple, and therefore the faces that, the revelations that God reveals to the world are also multiple. From the Islamic point of view, that is the Islamic perspective. That the essence of God is one, but he turns multiple faces to the world, and by virtue of that, multiple revelations are also necessary. There's a verse in the Quran that states that if all the oceans were ink and all the trees were pens, the word of God would not be exhausted, even if he added another one unto them. So Islam looks at the multiplicity or the universality of revelation as being metaphysically necessary. It's not an accidental thing. It reflects the infinitude of God. And therefore, there is a place for all of the various religious communities. And they are there, in a sense, to correspond to these different revelations of God. That we all, as different religious communities, have diverse spiritual, psychological, and other needs that these various revelations cater themselves to. And so Islam explicitly, in the Quran, which is the word-made book for Muslims, and so there's one point that also I'd like for you to take away tonight, is that oftentimes we compare the Quran to the Bible and Christ to the Prophet of Islam. Although that's one point of view to look at the two, a deeper theological perspective would be to compare the Quran to Christ himself as a manifestation of the world. And just as everything about Christ is sacred for Christians, everything about the Quran is sacred for Muslims, and the same would apply in a Jewish context. And so the word is brought by these various prophets in various forms to meet the different psychological and spiritual needs of these different communities. And therefore, Islam is very explicit, the most explicit of all the revelations, because, at least from the Islamic point of view, it comes at the end of this eschatological cycle of naming these other traditions. It explicitly names Jews and Christians and Sabians as people of the book, or Ahl al-Kitab, people of Scripture, and therefore requires that Muslims defend their houses of worship. And the Quran also states that of some of the prophets we have told you their names, but of others we have not told you their names. So that opened the door to all of the Eastern traditions. So for example, when the Persians met the Zoroastrians, for example, that Ahl Kitab, or people of Scripture, was extended to them. Or when the Muslims encountered the Chinese tradition, Lao Tzu or Confucius, the Muslims understood them to be prophets as well. Or Rama or Krishna from the Hindu traditions. So the status of people of Scripture was extended to all of the major religions of the world, from an Islamic perspective. And therefore, all of the major religions enjoyed rights to practice their own religion in their own community, being governed by their own spiritual laws. Because the Quran specifically says that it is, for each religious community, we have sent a law and a way. Both an exoteric law, you might say, and an esoteric way. And although we may outwardly be different in many respects, we share these commandments of love of God and love of neighbor that was mentioned earlier, that really unite us all. And some of these moral principles may find that outward expressions appearing to be very different, but they're inwardly united. So for example, when you have a cowboy enter a church, what does the cowboy do? Take off their hat, right? Whereas when a Jew or a Muslim enters a synagogue or a mosque, what is it that we do? We put on a yarmulke or a turban or something like that. Both of them are expressions of humility. Because on the one hand, a hat can express pride, depending on how you decorate it. On the other hand, showing one's hair can be an expression of pride. So the inner intention is the same, but the outward expression is different. So esoterically, the traditions, in a sense, the higher you go in terms of spiritual realization on that path, the closer we can appreciate the commonalities with one another. Outwardly, we all share the supreme commandments. But how many of us really realize them? It's only the great saints who do that. And it's the great saints who are the closest to one another and can appreciate one another and can look into each other's eyes and see those commonalities in a way that many of us who have not reached that level of spiritual realization may not. And so Islam has built within its structure, from a theological point of view and a legal point of view, this principle of the universality of revelation and protection of all of these different traditions and freedom of religion in that regard. Now, the doctrine of prophecy in Islam is really quite remarkable. On the one hand, what unites all the religions is the following phrase, La ilaha illallah, which is the first testimony of faith. It means no God, small g, but God, capital G. In other words, God is the source of all truth and all reality. That only God with a capital G is worthy of worship. And that's what's common to all of the various traditions. I'm fine? All right. And so that doctrine of Tawheed, or unity, should we switch? This is an expression of interfaith collaboration. That sets the mood. Dr. Cohen said it was very comforting words. It was nothing that I said. Part of the school of illumination. So, in any case, what unites all of the traditions is that God is the source of all truth and all reality, and that God is the only one worthy of worship. But what is it then that particularizes each tradition? If that's what we all share in common, even the supratheistic traditions like Buddhism, there are certain traditions that don't even speak about a personal God, because anything that we say about God, God is beyond that. So, but however, there's a large difference, enormous difference between La ilaha illa and then remaining silent. In other words, there's no God but, and then remaining silent, because anything we say, God is beyond that. And La ilaha, which is no God. One is atheism and one is supertheism, you might say. Supratheistic word. So those shouldn't be confused. So this La ilaha illallah is what all of the major world traditions share. But each tradition must have something that particularizes it in order for it to exist on this level of reality. So in other words, we can't experience woodness as such. We have to experience wood as a particular shape, in a particular form. Whether it's a square, rectangle, circle, triangle, whatever it is. But to say that that word or that piece of wood takes on a particular form implies a limitation, some type of finitude. But God's word is inexhaustible, it's infinite. And so therefore returning us once again to the need for multiple revelations. And so that is the Islamic basis for the doctrine of religious liberty. If Muslims didn't, let's say, have the same experiences that Christians did with respect to, in Christian history, with respect to certain religious minorities, It wasn't because Muslims were better than Christians in any sense of the imagination, but it was because of this theological doctrine of the universality of revelation. And the way that Muslims interpret Christ saying that I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to God but by me, is that when Christ says that, he is speaking as the Logos as such. He's not speaking as a particular manifestation of the Logos, if you understand what I mean by that. And so there's the supraformal Logos, and then there's the manifestation of the Logos. And it's very important to understand those differences. But whether or not we can reconcile these theological differences from a higher metaphysical point of view, that's not what we're trying to do here. But at least we're trying to come together for a better understanding, and that this is the Islamic view of the basis of religious liberty, and that each community would have the freedom to practice its rights according to its own tradition.
So, to our panelists, do you have questions for each other, clarifications, something that sparked your interest and you want to follow up on? And our students in the back of the cards, we're going to distribute those cards. And so, audience, if you're thinking about questions, maybe raise your hand and our card will be given and taken.
I'd like to start the conversation if you don't mind.
Yes, go right ahead.
Very quickly, and I asked my friends, one of the motifs of my remarks, I think, and I hope it came through, was how difficult it was for the Catholic Church to find in its tradition the theological resources for to recognize religious pluralism and to recognize the religious liberty of members of other traditions. Did Judaism and Islam go through a similar trial? Or was it as easy as it seems?
Well, Islam certainly did not have the same difficulties as Christianity did for the reasons that I outlined, because Islam asserts the universality of revelation explicitly in the Quran. And therefore, you have a theological basis for it, there's a legal basis for it, there's, among the philosophers, there's a philosophical basis for it. I mean, even Muslims considered, for example, Muslim philosophers considered that Pythagoras and Plato may have been prophets themselves, because Pythagoras would always talk about the one. Plato would talk about the supreme good. Aristotle would talk about the unmoved mover. So when the Muslims heard about that, they thought, wow, that sounds like they're talking about God to us, and so we're very interested in that type of talk. And so from an Islamic philosophical perspective, the Muslims were always interested in anything that would assert Tawheed. And they claimed that whatever asserted Tawheed, or the unity of God, was Islamic in the deepest sense, regardless of what language, ethnicity, whatever. And so the Muslims did not have a difficult time at all really trying to integrate and synthesize pre-Islamic beliefs that were consistent, and philosophies and science that was consistent with Tawheed.
I think in response to this, the clearest response that I can offer as we build on this discussion relates to a point that you made so well in your presentation, that relates to the nexus between religion and state power, and the implications of state power encroaching upon religion. And the reminder in many ways that throughout the vast majority of its history, the leaders of the Jewish faith, who have kept the embers of the Jewish faith warm enough for this tradition to remain alive with us to this very day, lacked that kind of access to power and that kind of ability to exercise anything resembling state power. Friends, it is not all that difficult to be a proponent of religious freedom and liberty when one is powerless, when one is subject to the restriction of one's religious freedom and liberty on the part of others. The real test to every society comes with that society and a religious tradition, whichever religious tradition we associate ourselves with, attaching itself to state power and wielding power upon its own members and upon others. And so what is reflected in our comments is not only the various interpretations and reflections of revelation and prophetic tradition, as Professor El-Ansary so ably demonstrated, but also the diversity of political, of social, and of historical experience, as you have spoken of. And in this regard, we always learn from each other's experiences.
Do you have more questions for each other? Okay, we'll move on to audience questions. Yeah? Yeah.
Okay, so here's the question. I feel like I'm taking my doctoral exams.
We'll just wait till you get to it.
You seem to create the state as a straw man in your argument. Can you historicize and particularize what the state is and are you actually talking about nationalism using state power to persecute? Let me focus on the first part of the question, because I think it's only fair to deal with one question at a time so that everyone has a chance to talk. You seem to create the state as a straw man. I wouldn't agree with that. I wouldn't agree with it because there's historical depth to my remarks. I'm not talking about pie in the sky, 18th century Kantian expectations for perpetual peace that is going to be realized only in a matter of time. We didn't get that. That's what the Enlightenment philosophers promised to us. We didn't get that. They definitely didn't get that in Europe. So there is a contest between the modern state, the modern secular state, I should say, and religious bodies that plays out in concrete historical circumstances across the world and continues to do so. One of the concerns that I have at this particular moment in time, as the world, at least in the West, becomes even more secular, whether there will be sufficient resources among the religious bodies, and I don't want to say churches, because I mean all of the religious traditions, not just represented here, but all of the religious traditions, whether there will be enough resources available to the religious bodies to protect religious freedom, to assert those limits on state power, so that people can continue to live in the way the founders, I think, intended for us to live and hoped that we would live. So I don't think I'm creating a straw man. I think that if you read contemporary history, modern history, these facts of the nature of this contest and the nature of the peril, frankly, that religious bodies face is clear.
So, not just an intellectual question, but what can individual practitioners of particular faiths do to help construct communities that then preserve and allow religious liberty to flourish?
This.
More of this. Good answer. Would you like to elaborate?
I have to say, friends, I have been in this country now this is my 20th year in this country. I was brought to this country by Hebrew Union College. The very first Jewish institution of higher learning in the Western Hemisphere that was established here in Cincinnati. And today, the single longest continually functioning rabbinical seminary anywhere in the world, established in 1875 because of the destruction of rabbinical seminaries in other parts of the world. I was brought to an extraordinary center of Jewish life in an extraordinary community to experience what President Armstrong referred to at the very beginning of this discussion, of our discussion this evening, in the defacing of our sign on our campus by a lone young man, a lone and lost soul. To discover an imam of the Clifton Mosque who would arrive on our campus and offer us support. To discover members of the clergy of neighboring churches who would come in and ask how they could help. To discover a member of the clergy of a church 10 miles away, 9.5 miles away, who came with a religious school group to decorate our sidewalks of the Hebrew Union College with messages of love. I discovered a community of religious diversity, not only of tolerance, but of love, of appreciation, of respect, that I did not know, that I did not recognize. I discovered that within 1 square mile of Hebrew Union College, there were 22 religious congregations whom we had failed to properly reach out to and to properly welcome onto our campus. The more we speak with each other, the more we come to know each other, the more we share our rituals, the more we discuss prophecy and theology and the principles of our faith, the greater the respect, the greater the collaboration, the greater the dignity that we will afford each other. And this is the reason for which we are so grateful for the leadership of Thomas More College, its president, and this Institute for Religious Liberties in bringing us all together.
That was beautifully said. If you don't mind, I'd just add one thing very quickly. If you want to advance religious liberty, you have to pay attention. Look, one reads recently about a jurisprudence working its way through the law schools, according to which the public expression of religion will be limited to the spatial limitations of church buildings. That's what's going to constitute, potentially, the public expression of religion. Going to church, going to synagogue, going to mosque, that's it. That is an entirely foreign way in this country of understanding the public expression of religion. And yet there it is. It's working its way through the law schools. Do you know that?
Who proposes that?
I read it in a newspaper. I don't remember the names of the people who are involved, but I could find out.
Please.
Sure.
Well, I'll just say something very, very, very briefly. What audience, so to speak, that we're speaking to.
Sure.
So, for example, Muslims in the United States, what should we be doing? Muslims in the United States need to educate themselves about their own intellectual heritage. That's from our Imam Ismail from Clifton. So if a lot of times there's so much misinformation and disinformation, and sometimes our youth, not that it's a huge problem, but it's really superficial. There's been, in the same way that the church has suffered from the onslaught of secular thought for centuries as a result of all of this bogus, things starting from the Galileo affair, which is a totally rewrite of history, to the alleged relation between religion and science and all of these things. It's, the church has, let me put it this way, gotten a bad rap. And so it's cut off many Catholics, I believe, from their own intellectual heritage. This is what's starting to happen in the Islamic world, where we have certain groups, such as the Wahhabis. I'll go ahead and name it. It's being recorded, so. In Saudi Arabia, for example, they have a truncated understanding of the Islamic tradition, where they reject Islamic philosophy and theology. So that's forbidden to be taught. And, on the other hand, they are against Islamic mysticism. So in other words, really realizing love of God and neighbor, that's the mystics, the saints are the ones who do that. And they have an impoverished understanding of Islamic law. Now, at the same time, they are taught Western science, with all the engineering and so forth. It's no mistake that most of the 9/11 attackers, terrorists, were from Saudi Arabia. That is not an accident. Because the science, it always involves philosophical presuppositions. The reduction of quality to quantity, the separation between the subject that knows and the object that's known, all of the Cartesian basis of modern science. That there is no ontological basis for values. Values are reducible to tastes. That's what modern science is essentially telling us. How can a religious worldview cohabit with a view of science like that? And so what happens is that we get a very deadly combination of religion and secular thought that leads to, with the necessary political conditions, to atrocities like 9/11. Now, Saudi Arabia, because of the petrodollars, has pumped this type of thought out all over the world. And unfortunately, it also entered here in the United States. I'm from Egypt originally. One of Mubarak's mistakes was that he allowed the Saudi money to come into Egypt and have this brand of Islam taught, which is not indigenous to Egypt at all. Egypt has Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar University is the oldest Islamic university fully functioning in the world. It's even older than Oxford and Cambridge. It's the Oxford-Cambridge of the Islamic world. It goes back to 970 is its founding. That is our intellectual heart. The overwhelming majority of Egyptian people take their guidance from them. But because the Mubarak administration wanted to have this divide and conquer strategy with the Muslim Brotherhood, they let these Salafi Wahhabi guys in so that they would play politics in this dirty way. The scholars at Al-Azhar University said, don't do this. This is going to be a disaster. Christians are going to die. Muslims are going to die. Both. And then now they're pulling their hair out, wishing that they had listened to the scholars at Al-Azhar on these types of issues. So there's an intellectual crisis going on within the Islamic world itself as a result of the Wahhabis. And part of it is also driven by the fact that the youth, the most humiliating thing for the youth is colonization. And the youth tend to think that whoever has the power has the truth. And so therefore, instead of our Islamic tradition being a source of truth, strength, and beauty, many of the youth started to think that it's a source of error, weakness, and ugliness, and turned their back on the intellectual tradition. So that set in place the necessary intellectual conditions for many of the problems that we're seeing today. And I'm not saying that it's as widespread as, I mean, really, the violent terrorists, the real violent terrorists, extremists, would be, like 1 in 10,000. I mean, it's equivalent to the murder rate that you see here in the United States. But the problem is that the Wahhabis are almost like the catalysts for this thing. Think of it like concentric circles. That the Wahhabis are the large circle, and as you go further and further in, you get to that extremist core. And so that extremist core is a subset of that wider Wahhabi element. So in answer to this question, the most important thing that we need to recover, and really I say this with respect to all of our Abrahamic traditions, we must recover our intellectual heritage. We must recover what it means, what the liberal arts truly mean, in the sense that Pythagoras and Plato discussed, in terms of that which liberates the soul. Now, I know professors vote Democrat a lot, but not that kind of liberal, but in terms of the quadrivium, that numbers have a symbolic meaning to them, that relate them to God. And I wish I had more time to discuss this. But that's the true meaning of the liberal arts. We have forgotten about that because this secular bomb has been dropped upon our educational system, and we no longer know how to think in the categories that people just a few hundred years ago would understand instantly what somebody meant by a liberal arts education. At Xavier University, what is our motto? It's supposed to be, we are a Jesuit Catholic university rooted in the liberal arts tradition. How many students know what that means? I'm not going to ask the question of how many faculty knows. But in any case, I would say that the root cause of this is an intellectual and spiritual crisis.
I wonder if you could comment on, let's say I really want to know more about Judaism. I've come to this panel and I am convinced that there should be more understanding across the traditions. How am I just supposed to show up at your mosque or your synagogue or your Catholic church and partake of that and learn about that? How does that work?
It's, my friends, for all of you who are here, students, faculty, members of the community, all of you, please know that you are absolutely, entirely welcome on the campus of the Hebrew Union College. You are welcome to reach out to me, to reach out to our offices. We would be thrilled to offer you a tour. We hold services at the college. We hold interfaith services at the college in our historic chapel. I hereby invite all of you to come and visit us.
We also have tours at the Islamic Center of Greater Cincinnati, and of course, Imam Ismail at the Islamic Center in Clifton. He's wonderful. He's closer, so go. I would also suggest, if you're into reading a single book, there's a book by Hussein Nasr called Ideals and Realities of Islam. He's the leading Islamic studies scholar in the West. I had the privilege of studying under him. It's a fabulous book. Everybody loves it. And then finally, with a little bit of self-promotion, I offered an online course on Introduction to Islam this summer at Xavier. and all of those things are up on YouTube. So, and they're in 5 to 7 minute segments to make it easy. So, if you're interested in that, there is, you can YouTube it. Risk of self-promotion.
So you're here as scholars, but I think also as practitioners. And so the question is, have you ever seriously questioned your faith? And how does that questioning or skepticism, maybe on a continuum, how does that inform your understanding about religious liberty? You don't have to answer the question if you don't feel comfortable.
I would just say very quickly, if I've had crises of faith, they haven't had to do with intellectual life. They've had to do with moral struggles of this type or another. Intellectually, I've always been a robust Catholic.
What does that
I've always tried to align my life with the teachings of the Church. But at the same time, I have a tremendous regard for secular learning because it's so tremendously powerful and gives us knowledge that we want to have. To say nothing of the fact that most of my academic friends are secular scholars. And I think that has everything to do with the Catholic tradition because it's understanding of reason. I mentioned that in my talk. Its understanding of reason is so strong. Its respect for reason is so strong throughout the tradition, but perhaps especially so now. When it comes to these types of ideas and sensibilities with regard to religious liberty, it was always easy for me, as I mentioned, to recognize in other religious traditions an objective good there. And that, I think, comes from being a good Catholic. I really do. If you want to be a good Catholic, if you understand the faith, then you look at other traditions that in many cases are older than our own, and just as culturally productive and intellectually robust as others. And you can see this kind of inherent goodness in what happens in those traditions that deserves respect and the esteem of all Catholics. I think that's ingredient to what it means to be a faithful Christian. To say nothing of the fact that the Bible simply doesn't tolerate the kind of intolerance that is threatened to wreck the world.
The truth of the matter is that perhaps unlike others, I struggle all the time. I struggle throughout. And I struggle throughout with a sense of a revelation that has arrived to us via the written word and via the book. And with a sense that this revelation is interpreted and reinterpreted and re-examined and questioned and re-questioned throughout. And when one recognizes the very basic notion that divine revelation, in terms of its corpus, is finite, but that in terms of the meaning of its words is infinite, as Professor Al-Ansary elucidated earlier, the struggle with revelation, the struggle with our interpretation of what it ought to mean to be truly a religious human and a Jew, is a struggle against a lack of energy and a lack of imagination. At the end of the day, the interpretation of what it means to us to live as religious people, seeking truth here in the context of our religious traditions, that failure is the failure of the human condition. It is the failure of being unable to fully see one's other. It is the failure of not quite being able to recognize the beauty, the splendor that surrounds us. It is the failure to fully realize, to fully appreciate the obligation and commitment that arise from our place here on this earth for the time that is allotted to us. And so, I struggle. And I will tell you, I wish upon myself to never cease to struggle.
Well, in Islam has a soteriological function of knowledge. In other words, knowledge is what saves. Not just head knowledge, but knowledge that is cardiac. In other words, it really penetrates the whole of our being. When we realize that God is everything and that we're nothing. And therefore, Islam cannot be indifferent to other forms of knowing. It cannot be indifferent to other truth claims. And therefore, for me, the challenge was growing up in the States, and I went to a secular high school. It was a great high school. I got a great education there from a secular point of view, but from a religious point of view, everything was fragmented. It was almost as if you go to one class, say your biology class, open the drawer, put that bit of knowledge in, close it. Then you go to your history class, open the drawer, put that in, close it. Go to your, philosophy class, open the drawer, close it. Not philosophy.
Not philosophy.
But physics or whatever. That all knowledge was fragmented. And Islam is based on tawheed, or integration. That reality, God is the source of all truth and all reality. And therefore, if reality is integrated and a unity, then there must be a unity, integration of knowledge. And Islamic civilization and Muslims themselves cannot survive without that sense of integration. And for me, I never had an existential doubt about God. I mean, I had maybe some questions and so forth in my mind about proofs of God when I was in high school or junior high school or whatever. But that was fine. It didn't get down to existential doubt. But looking for that integration. Aristotle was called the first teacher because he was the first to classify all the different modes of knowledge. Al-Farabi, who was a Muslim philosopher, scientist, was called the second teacher because he was the first one to do that in an Islamic context. Integrate all the pre-Islamic knowledge with Islamic knowledge. Mir Damad was called the third teacher because he did that in a Shiite context. Today we need a fourth teacher to do that with secular thought, to be able to integrate the findings of modern science into higher orders of knowledge. And for me, the person who was able to do that was Sayyid Al-Ansary, I mentioned before. He did his bachelor's in physics at MIT. He was top of his class, broke the math exam record, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, he was amazing. He has a volume in the Library of Living Philosophers as well. And so he's the first Muslim to have that. He was given the top honor in theology, which is the Gifford Lectures. He's only the second person in history to have been awarded both honors, Dewey and Alfred North Whitehead being the other two. So he's in good company. So for him, he was, in a sense, for me, the fourth teacher. So that resolved for me the issue that there's not just Muslims who do physics. there is such a thing as Islamic physics, that there is an Islamic solution to quantum paradox. Quantum paradox is actually good physics refuting bad philosophy. It really is. There is a Catholic solution, and Wolfgang Smith is a wonderful Catholic theologian and physicist whose dissertation research helped solve the re-entry problem for NASA. I mean, he's off the chart. This is when he was 22 years old. He and Dr. Nasser are good friends, and they've discussed this, where we actually have a religious interpretation of quantum mechanics that resolves quantum mechanics on one, quantum paradox on one hand, and integrates the findings of physics into higher orders of knowledge on the other. That is the type of integration that we need, I think. And that's what helps me overcome any of those internal questions.
So, I think maybe, do you want, we'll do this one last question.
All right, or if you want to,
Waleed, no?
it's all right. All right, it's very quick. It just says, is there a refutation of extremism found within the original teaching of Islam, or is there a modern interpretation work that needs to be done by Islamic scholars? Absolutely, there is within the Islamic tradition a total refutation of this. I've got an article on that available, and many other scholars have written so many articles on this. This is one big difference between what goes on here and what is known in the Islamic world. Christians in the Islamic world, for example, may say they know that Islam is opposed to terrorism and extremism, but they're concerned, for example, Coptic Christians in Egypt are concerned about the level of security that the state is able to provide for them. So their complaint is not that, oh, you guys aren't against terrorism. Of course we're against terrorism. More Muslims have been killed anyway by these guys than anybody else. But so what I want to, and the reason I picked that on purpose, that example on purpose, is that the Christians in the Middle East themselves know that Islam as a religion is against this type of extremism. But their complaint or concern is whether or not the state is responsive enough to their security needs. Now, the Egyptian government has never turned down any request for security. And unfortunately, some of the terrorists who get through, basically the Muslim guards who are there, are the first ones to die. So it's not as if the state is not willing or trying to provide that security, but sometimes they're just not able to. But here, unfortunately, in the United States, we don't have that kind of perspective. We know Timothy McVeigh, for example, is on the lunatic fringe of Christianity. But 2/3 of what we see on American television is the lunatic fringe for the Muslims. I'd like to see Imam Ismail on CNN, like, constantly. And so when we have somebody looking like him in traditional garb and speaking the American accent the way that he does and having an Irish background to boot, then I think that will clarify this issue.
So I think in the theater world, we say we're going to leave them wanting more. So I think maybe we'll stop now, but people would be welcome to come up and ask particular questions if they needed, if they wanted. And also, I think we have some ideas about other interfaith gatherings. If you're interested, I'd be happy to share those particulars with you. Would you please join me in thanking our guests?